Today is September 22nd, 2024. The conflict in Ukraine continues to grind on. Russian forces continue making incremental gains along the line of contact, particularly toward the urban area Pokrovsk. Now, I'm going to go over several Western articles talking about that and also the general state of Ukraine's military, along with admissions now that the U.S. is simply incapable of supplying Ukraine what it needs to match or exceed Russian military capabilities. But one thing that I did notice is the Western media citing Ukrainian sources claiming that Ukraine has managed to stop Russian forces on their advance to Pokrovsk. But the reality is they are so close now that it has transitioned from an approach to Pokrovsk to a siege of Pokrovsk. So we'll get into all of that. Let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map. Keep that in mind when we look at it. You can see Russian long-range strikes all across Ukraine as usual. We zoom in on this large salient extending northwest from Donetsk city. Again, remember, Avdiivka, right here, was the front at the beginning of 2024. It is now all the way over here, and this is Pokrovsk, and you can see that there is a large built-up urban area extending away from Pokrovsk. So there is a lot of urban terrain here, which is easily fortified and defended by Ukrainian forces. Russian forces were advancing at a certain rate over open country or small towns and villages. When they reach a denser urban environment, they have to slow down because it takes longer to grind down the defenses there. That is what this whole process is. So to imagine that Russian forces are going to continue advancing at the same rate even when they reach Pokrovsk is unrealistic. And this is just media spin propaganda to try to make the situation look better for Ukraine than it actually is. We see Russian forces continue advancing in this urban area near Donetsk. We'll hear this mentioned in the Western media this week. And Russian forces continue fighting all along the line of contact, incrementally advancing. They're still fighting here in this relatively newer front. Russia opened up north of Kharkov. No real advances there, but the fighting continues, whether we hear about it or not in the media. And of course, the Kursk incursion, Ukrainian forces operating in this area. Last update, I had showed you that they had this territory as well, and they have been pushed back. Russian forces drove down to the border, and now they have compromised the western flank of Ukraine's area of operation here. Commentators, pro-Ukrainian commentators, claimed that this incursion here was meant to encircle, trap, and destroy the Russian counteroffensive, but nothing of the sort has happened, and nothing of the sort is likely to happen. Again, the reality is Ukraine does not have enough manpower, equipment, ammunition just to hold the line of contact. This incursion into Kursk has been a strategic blunder. There is no way they're going to somehow turn the whole conflict around and begin surrounding and destroying entire Russian brigades. This is fantasy. Let's start looking at the Western articles regarding Pokrovsk, this city in Donbass, the Donbass region that Russian forces have now arrived at. If they don't die, our infantry will. Ukraine's pivotal battle for Donetsk. And here it says Russian forces are gathering on Pokrovsk, a logistics base and transport hub, after months of slow, brutal advance. So the advance toward Pokrovsk has now transitioned to the siege of Pokrovsk. This is a transitioning period. The article says Pokrovsk is a logistics base and major transport hub for Ukraine's armed forces. Multiple roads and rail lines intersect here. Without it, Kiev will struggle to move troops, food, and ammunition to other parts of an overstretched front line. To the embattled city of Donetsk, which I just showed you on the map, that Russia is also basically encircling and creeping towards. The city's fate is bound up with that of Donetsk province as a whole. So very important, according to The Guardian. And yet Ukrainian forces have categorically failed to stop Russia's approach to the city And now they are going to be fighting against the siege of the city. A bloody battle looms. Russian troops are a mere 6 miles away. That's about 10 kilometers. Virtually every heavy weapon system Russia has is now in range of Pokrovsk. There is continual noise from incoming and outgoing shells. Last week, Russian warplanes smashed bridges in and around the city, setting the stage for a future frontal attack. So these are shaping operations for the actual siege of the city. Again, I'm trying to impress upon the fact that this is no longer an advance toward Pokrovsk, but the siege of this city. Over the last 2 weeks, Russia's momentum has nearly stopped. We have slowed down their advance. They are moving forward, but with less potential. So this was according to a Ukrainian artillery commander being interviewed by The Guardian. But of course, again, realistically, they've arrived at a heavily fortified urban center. They're going to slow down, and they are going to besiege the city. They're not going to keep advancing at the same pace. So this is a artillery commander who either doesn't understand what's happening and he's misinterpreting the slowing down of Russian forces, or he's spinning this reality to try to make the situation look better for Ukraine than it actually is. This is a repeat of Avdiivka and Bakhmut, both cities Ukrainian forces lost, along with huge amounts of manpower and equipment in this futile attempt to hold both cities. The same process will now unfold with Pokrovsk. Then the article says, Vitaly Milovodov, the 15th Brigade's press officer, said the West was partly to blame for Ukraine's step-by-step reversals in 2024. So Ukraine is suffering reversals, and Ukrainian military officers are admitting that. He cited White House restrictions on the use of U.S.-supplied long-range weapons, the subject of discussions last week in Washington between Joe Biden and Keir Starmer. Milovodov said that if deep strikes were permitted, Ukraine could hit weapon dumps and aerodromes used by Russia in its grinding assaults on Ukraine's east. It will make enemy logistics more difficult. This was the same argument we heard about giving HIMARS and ATACMS to Ukraine, and yet it did none of these things. Giving them these small numbers of longer range missiles also will not make any difference. This is just a hope, a first step on I would say, short road to disappointment for Ukrainians who think this will make some sort of difference. They will have to move everything 250 to 300 kilometers back from the front lines, he noted. If we had got a green light earlier, a military situation would be different. There would be no advance on Pokrovsk. I don't believe that is true. There have been areas that Russia has been advancing toward Ukrainian forces where their logistics, their air bases, let's just say Crimea, for example, everything on the Crimean Peninsula is in range of these these Western weapons transferred over to Ukraine. Ukraine is hitting these facilities, but they're not doing it often enough or on a large enough scale to make any sort of difference. The Guardian cites this artillery commander. Again, we've had 3 years of war. If we receive enough weapons, victory is absolutely possible. But as I pointed out many times for the last 2 years, there aren't enough weapons to send Ukraine. Even if the West wanted to, they do not have enough weapons to send to Ukraine to make a difference. Ukraine is incapable, even if there were enough weapons, to absorb, integrate them into their armed forces, and use them to make any sort of difference. Now, I have been saying that for 2 years. I've been called a Russian propagandist for doing so, but now we have a CNN article saying, citing the Pentagon, actually, explaining every single thing that I have been saying for the last 2 years in this article, published on September 17th, 2024. U.S. military aid packages to Ukraine shrink amid concerns over Pentagon stockpiles. Now, for months and months now, since the funding delay ended and the flow of arms and ammunition began, I pointed out how the arms packages announced by the Department of Defense were small, and how there were no quantities mentioned because what they were doing was drawing from monthly production rates. Monthly production rates are public knowledge. You can look it up. You can see how small the monthly rate of production is for all of these weapons and all of these munitions. And when you consider that not all of US monthly production is being sent to Ukraine, you realize the number is actually even smaller than that. But even if all of it was sent to Ukraine, it's simply not enough. And there are no plans to expand production fast enough or large enough to make a difference. They're not even talking about doing it. And to do it would take years. Now CNN admits all of this. This is what CNN says. U.S. military aid packages for Ukraine have been smaller in recent months, as the stockpiles of weapons and equipment that the Pentagon's willing to send Kiev from its own inventory have dwindled. The shift comes amid concerns about U.S. military readiness being impacted as U.S. arms manufacturers play catch-up to the huge demand created by the war against Russia. The shortage means the Biden administration still has $6 billion in funds available to arm and equip Ukraine, but the Pentagon lacks the inventory it is willing to deliver more than 2 years into the war. 2 U.S. officials told CNN. So this was something that I have repeatedly said. When we hear about huge amounts of money being talked about, being sent to Ukraine, seized Russian assets being used by weapons for Ukraine, the weapons physically don't exist to buy in the first place. That has been the problem. It's not a matter of political will or financial resources. It is a matter of military industrial production and its inability to physically produce enough weapons and ammunition. The article continues. It says, it's about the stockpiles we have on our shelves, what the Ukrainians are asking for, and whether we can meet those requests with what we currently have without impacting readiness, one of the officials said. And again, I had explained before the funding delay began that the US military was already running low in terms of stockpiles. They were unable to expand production fast enough. And what that meant was a continuously shrinking amount of arms and ammunition sent to Ukraine. All the while, the same Western media has been admitting incrementally over the last 2 years that Russian military industrial production has been expanding. We remember stories in 2022 about Russia running out of missiles. Any day now, they're going to run out of missiles. Now the Western media admits Russia is firing more missiles than ever. They expanded military industrial production. I've gone in extensive detail about how this was possible, how Russia is able to do this, and why the United States is unable to do this. And it all comes down to the way each military industrial base was organized. The US has a for-profit, private industry run military industrial base. They seek to maximize profits. They create small quantities of highly expensive weapons that are not necessarily better weapons. They're very sophisticated and therefore very expensive. They maximize their profit margins. Russia, on the other hand, has a state-owned military industrial base. It exists solely to produce whatever the state feels it needs for national defense. It is not trying to, it makes profits, but it's not trying, it doesn't exist or prioritize the maximization of profits. They have invested in industrial capacity that they might not even need at the time. They just anticipate it may be needed, so they invested in it. Private corporations will not do that because that cuts into their profit margins. A state-owned enterprise disinterested with the maximization of profits will do that. And this is something that has happened over the course of years, I would say even decades. And this is why the United States and Europe cannot just in a year or two's time just flip their whole industrial base around and produce as much as Russia is already producing. Even if they were to make the right decisions, which they're not even talking about doing, such as nationalizing their defense industry, it would take many years to catch up to Russia. Russia has a head start, and Russia continuously expands their military industrial production as this conflict continues. Now, CNN continues. It says, replenishment is also an issue, the official said. The U.S. is ramping up production of key items such as 155mm ammunition. These are artillery shells, and Patriot missile systems, both to supply Ukraine and to refill U.S. inventories. But it is a year's long process, not a year-long process, years with an S, long process that won't quickly meet the surging demand. I would say it won't meet it at all ever, the way it is going. Before the war in Ukraine, the U.S. produced approximately 15,155mm artillery shells each month. With new factories and production lines opening, the U.S. is now producing 40,000 shells a month, but it will still take more than a year for the Pentagon to hit its goal of 100,000 shells each month. But even if they reach 100,000 shells a month, it is still less than what Russia is making right now. The process for ramping up production is on schedule, but the process will take years, again, years with an S, requiring new facilities, expanded factories, and Congress willing to allocate the money. So that in certain instances, they're talking about steps that need to be taken that have not even been approved of or funded. And obviously, this is going to impact the strategic trajectory of this conflict, as I have been saying for the past 2 years now. Ukraine, and so this is CNN, Ukraine is feeling the impact of the inventory shortages, according to President Vladimir Zelensky. During a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Germany this month, this is a monthly meeting of all of Ukraine's Western sponsors, and they all scrape together symbolic shows of support to compel Ukrainians to continue fighting on despite the futility of it. Zelensky told the U.S. and other allies that deliveries of promised air defense systems were moving too slowly and warned of a significant shortfall in vital aid. Again, especially in terms of air defense systems, the U.S. doesn't make anywhere near as many. There's not even a plan being discussed to sufficiently expand the production of, say, Patriot missiles. And by the way, there was a Patriot missile shortage before Russia's special military operation even began. The U.S. was out of Patriot missiles for customers during Saudi Arabia's war with Yemen-based Ansar Allah. Ansar Allah was launching drones, missiles, rockets at targets in Saudi Arabia. Not only was the Patriot missile ineffective at stopping these incoming targets, they were running out of interceptors to even try to intercept them in the first place. Then the article talks about the ability for Ukraine to absorb huge amounts of support. So let's just pretend that the US and Europe somehow did have enough arms and ammunition. I've heard people online complaining that the US doesn't send spare M1 Abrams, Bradleys, M113s that are sitting in boneyards in the desert in the hundreds. Why don't we just send them all to Ukraine? They don't understand how extensive the process is of refurbishing them. They also don't understand the fact that Ukraine does not have the infrastructure to support them, to sustain them on the battlefield, to repair them when they are broken, to even recover them when they are lost on the battlefield. CNN says there are limits to how quickly we can draw down equipment without impacting military readiness. This we understand, which is one reason packages get spaced out, the official said. There are also limits, the official added, to how quickly Ukraine can absorb the equipment and distribute it effectively. And this comes down to, again, infrastructure, also training. You have more Patriot missile systems. Are there Ukrainians capable of operating them effectively? The answer is no. Are there Ukrainian pilots prepared to effectively pilot US-made F-16s, regardless of what country donates them? The answer is no, and there won't be. It takes years to train these pilots. It could take a year or longer to train missile operators. And these are occupations, these are soldiers, specialties, people who are being targeted on the battlefield and being lost and who need to be replaced. Just keeping up with battlefield losses is hard enough. Bringing in and training more to absorb additional equipment, if it even existed, that is an even more complex problem. CNN admits the U.S. is still trying to announce a new aid package roughly every 2 weeks, the official added, which Ukraine is supportive of because they believe getting new packages every 2 weeks is a morale boost. So it goes from actually facilitating Ukraine's ability to fight Russia to simply convincing Ukrainians they have the ability to fight Russia. That is what these packages have gone from to now the purpose that they're serving. At the same time, the Western media admits Ukrainian problems and how these problems are compounding. They also try to impress upon the public that Russia also has problems, which Russia most certainly does have problems. This is a costly conflict. Russia is suffering losses. They have to invest huge amounts of public money into its military, into this conflict that could have been better spent elsewhere. But is it enough to change the strategic trajectory of the conflict? And that is the problem for the US and the Ukrainian proxies. It isn't. But let's just give an example. Over the last week or so, I saw this. Ukraine claims to have destroyed large Russian ammunition depot in overnight drone attack. This was September 18th, 2024. When you see these huge explosions, it's almost always an ammunition depot. That is what happens when you blow up huge concentrations of weapons and ammunition, all concentrated in one area. The CNN article says Ukrainian drone attack launched overnight destroyed an ammunition depot in western Russian region of Tver. And this is northwest of Moscow, quite a bit northwest of Moscow, very, very close to the border with the Baltic nations. And this CNN is citing Ukraine's security service, the SBU. It caused a massive blast. The Ukrainian drones targeted the Russian Defense Ministry operated warehouse in the city of Toropets, which was storing Iskander tactical missile systems, Tochka-U tactical missile systems, guided aerial bombs, and artillery ammunition, the source said. Russia doesn't even use Tochka-U tactical missiles anymore. It has been replaced by the Iskander. So it's odd that they mentioned Tochka-U missiles. But again, this is according to Ukraine. So we have to keep in mind that Ukraine may be embellishing the truth. Now, I was listening to Mark Sloboda talk about this specific attack. He was talking about how this arms depot and most arms depots are supposed to be heavily hardened facilities, knowing that they will be targets of military strikes, even missile strikes. You would require a very large missile specifically for penetrating armored structures. Did these drones possess that capability? Or was this yet another lapse or a case of complacency amid operational security across Russian forces? I would suspect that that is what happened. There were hardened facilities, and then there were probably warehouses or ammunition being left out in the open, vulnerable to attack, again, because of complacency. And it has given Ukraine this opportunity. Now, you have to remember, Ukraine does not have the intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance capabilities to know that. So this was an attack based on ISR from NATO, and almost certainly planning with NATO to carry out, even if it was Ukrainian drones that ultimately carried out the attack. Now let's just imagine that every single surplus Iskander glide bomb artillery shell that Russia has in its inventory were for some reason stored in this depot, and they all were destroyed in this drone attack. Russian monthly production is so vast that it would still be able to carry on military operations with an advantage on the battlefield, even if this were the case, even though it's almost certainly not the case. Ukraine has been striking and occasionally destroying Russian ammunition depots all along both the front and also behind the front line in Russian territory for years now. They've been carrying out drone strikes like this, missile strikes across Crimea like this, across the Donbas region where there are arms depots, storage areas with huge amounts of ammunition. They have targeted these, they have destroyed them. The problem is they're not doing it fast enough. You would have to do it faster than Russia can produce arms and ammunition, which they are not. Now, we already see that Ukraine is suffering from a lack of arms and ammunition. Every time Russia hits an arms depot, that makes it even worse. Ukraine is surely impacting the intensity of Russian military operations when they hit an arms depot, even if it just affects it slightly. But they're not affecting it strategically, and that is their problem. It makes for great headlines, but it does nothing to change the strategic trajectory of this conflict. That is the problem. Now, I was also listening to Alex Christoforou of the Duran in a recent video regarding this particular attack, and he was talking about how an attack like this is being showcased specifically to make the argument either to policymakers or to the public that, see, we can do this with drones. Imagine if you let us use long-range Western missiles like ATACMS or the British Storm Shadow or French Scalp air-launched cruise missiles. Imagine how much more damage we could do if you just lifted restrictions and allowed us to strike inside Russian territory. And the CNN article even says, at the very end, it says this, just throwing it in there for you to think about. Ukraine has been pushing its key allies, including the United States, to give the go-ahead to carry out missile strikes on targets deeper into Russian territory. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned NATO members that lifting restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range missile systems would mean entering into war with Russia itself. And now, as Alexander Mikuris, also the Duran, and Mark, Alex, and Alexander's information will be in the video description below. They provide daily updates on the conflict in Ukraine, in-depth updates. As Alexander Mikuris has pointed out, these long-range missile strikes, just like this drone strike, would require NATO ISR, NATO planning, and they would also require NATO personnel to actually handle these weapons and prepare them for these strikes. So it essentially would be the West carrying out these missile strikes, just using Ukraine as an intermediary for plausible deniability. That's why Russia would consider this war with the West. Now, again, the problem is that the West does not make long-range missiles in quantities large enough to strike targets with large enough barrages to overcome Russian air and missile defenses, and to strike at targets frequently enough to make any sort of difference. These weapons are already being provided to Ukraine. Ukraine is already using them, and they have demonstrated an inability to use them to change anything strategically about this conflict. Why would spreading out the use of these missiles over a much larger area make any sort of difference? It's not going to. It's going to raise the cost for Russia without doubt, but it is not going to do it on a scale large enough to change the conflict strategically. Something else Western missile strikes on Russia will do, that is certainly not going to help Ukraine or its Western sponsors, is likely galvanize the Russian population. Ukraine has already been carrying out these drone strikes on Russia. They had targeted Moscow deliberately to bring the war to the Russian population. And then the West's own polling of Russian sentiment found that all this did was galvanize the Russian population behind the government and behind the special military operation. Then there is what Russia could do in response to such strikes. Russia is warning not to do it. What would they do in response? And a lot of people reacting emotionally to a Western missile strike on Russia would demand immediate retaliation. But what Russia most likely is going to do is exercise patience and respond in a very measured way. The Russian Federation could pick any number of US or even British military targets all around the globe, far outside the US, and strike them in such a way that they could maintain plausible deniability for themselves, and they could severely undermine the US's position, say, in the Middle East, or even in Africa at this point. People get frustrated with this approach, but it is an approach that has served Russia well. They have used this very same approach in Syria. The US and its proxies have repeatedly tried to provoke Russia into some sort of escalation in Syria, but Russia has resisted. And even though the United States maintains an occupation of Syrian territory east of the Euphrates River, and it is denying the Syrian Arab Republic the ability to reclaim all of its territory, the US, in the process, is weakening itself, its position in the Middle East. From the moment it intervened in Syria, started the proxy war in 2011, it intervened in 2014, and then it expanded its intervention in 2015 in response to Russia's own intervention. It has been gradually weakening both in Syria and around the region. Russia is playing a long-term strategic game. They are not responding instantly to satisfy some short-term emotional desire for revenge. Their revenge is going to be winning this in the long term. That is what they're committed to doing. Now, what about Russian losses? I saw this article in the BBC. Volunteers dying as Russia's war dead tops 70,000. Now, 70,000 is a large number, without doubt. Ukraine has certainly lost many times more than 70,000, but this is many times smaller than the number Ukraine claims Russia has lost, and it is much smaller than the US, British, and other European governments have claimed Russia has lost. And this is all part of the Media Zona project, and a lot of these graphs are actually here in the article itself. And as you can see, distribution of dead Russian soldiers by category. It's also by time. And you can see that there was a large amount of deaths recorded in the very beginning. It tapered out, it spiked again, it tapered out, it spiked a little bit, and it now has been tapering off ever since. Russian losses are going down, according to this graph published by the BBC. If we scroll down, here's another one. Weekly Russian volunteer deaths in the war in Ukraine. We can see that it has spiked up and down, and over the last several months, it has been going down. Now, it's important to understand that there is a delay in the statistics by about 1 to 2 months, but this decline has been taking place well over 1 or 2 months. The article says more than 70,000 people fighting in Russia's military have now died in Ukraine, according to data now analyzed by the BBC. And for the first time, volunteers, civilians who joined the armed forces after the start of the war, now make up the highest number of people killed on the battlefield since Russia's full-scale invasion began in 2022. So this, again, this is per the BBC Media Zona project. They mention that in the article. It contradicts the enormous numbers Ukraine, the US, the UK, France, and many others are regularly citing. The article also says, since October last year, weekly fatalities of volunteers have not dipped below 100. And in some weeks, we have recorded more than 310 volunteer deaths. That's pretty low, considering this other BBC article from 2022. This BBC article from June 2022 says Ukrainian casualties, Kiev losing up to 200 troops a day, not per week, per day. And that was according to Zelensky aide. A senior Ukrainian presidential aide has told the BBC that between 100 and 200 Ukrainian troops are being killed on the front line every day. This was Podolyak, and he said Ukraine needed hundreds of Western artillery systems to level the playing field with Russia and the eastern Donbas region. He's associating high Ukrainian losses with a disparity in artillery firepower. Well, that disparity has only grown since. So we could assume that as Russian casualties fall, Ukrainian casualties are rising, and because of many, many other factors as well. We saw the CNN article admitting that the amount of weapons and ammunition available to send Ukraine is dwindling. If that is the case and Russian military power continues to grow, the amount of casualties are going to reflect that on both sides. Russian casualties will shrink and Ukrainian casualties will grow. Now, despite this attempt to showcase Russian losses, and Russia is suffering losses, but again, if you consider it in relation to Ukraine's losses and what impact it is actually having strategically, you can see that it looks bad in terms of headlines, in terms of propaganda, but in terms of conducting this military operation, it is not impeding Russia in any way. And now we have, well, we had the CNN article admitting that the US is unable to provide Ukraine with the military support it needs. And now we have this Washington Post. It's an opinion piece, but it's an opinion piece published in the Washington Post nonetheless. The losing strategy of underestimating Russia, which is something that the Western media, Western officials, Ukrainian officials had been doing since the beginning of this special military operation, and actually something that they have been doing in their attempt to politically capture Ukraine before 2014 and ever since. Russia remains a formidable power. The West should not assume it is a depleted military force. I don't know why they would assume that, because the Western media is admitting the West is depleted, Ukraine is depleted, and Russia continues expanding its military power. So it's talking about Russia remaining a formidable threat. And it says, that sobering fact often gets lost amid China's rising threat and Washington's pivot to the Indo-Pacific. It shouldn't, because it would be a mistake once again to underestimate the Kremlin's resolve to challenge the US-led order or Moscow's staying power in Ukraine. The outset of Vladimir Putin's full-scale war in Ukraine exposed Russia's ground forces as incompetently led and beholden to a tyrant in thrall to his own arrogance and neo-imperial ambitions. The ensuing stalemate, now into its third year, has been a strategic calamity for Moscow. But then it claims, yet if Russia is a corrupt, retrograde, nihilistic power, it remains a power. Given the West's pattern of misreading Moscow's resilience, it's worth taking stock of the menace it still poses far beyond Ukrainian borders. It's talking about misreading Moscow's resilience, but then everything in this previous paragraph that I just read about it being incompetently led and beholden to a tyrant in thrall to his own arrogance and neo-imperial ambitions, isn't that also a misreading of Russia and its motivations and its involvement in this conflict? I think it's very obvious to see that that is the case. So even as this opinion piece argues against misreading Russia, it itself is also misreading Russia. And if you refuse to face reality, the reality of the problem that you face, you're never going to find a sufficient solution to that problem, because you can't even admit what the problem is in the first place. Then the article says it's worth remembering that Putin's nuclear saber rattling, which has successfully intimidated Western leaders into slowing weapons deliveries to Ukraine, has involved more than rhetoric. On his orders, Russian forces in May rehearsed preparations for launching tactical nuclear weapons. The article, I think, correctly argues that you should not dismiss Russian threats to use nuclear weapons if they feel they need to. But this article is claiming that nuclear saber rattling is slowing the delivery of Western weapons. But again, we just read the CNN article admitting that these weapons don't physically exist to send Ukraine in the first place. So it's not Russian intimidation slowing down the delivery of weapons. It's not any sort of political hesitation or a lack of financial resources. It is the fact that the weapons cannot be physically made fast enough in large enough quantities to send Ukraine. And as the Pentagon itself admitted, Ukraine couldn't absorb them even if they could make them fast enough. Then the article says, Moscow can outlast Washington and its allies through the sheer mass of Russian forces and resources, and by keeping the West off balance with threats of escalation. Putin's strategy seems increasingly sound as public support for Ukraine has softened in the United States and parts of Europe. There, hopes have receded that Russia can be defeated on the battlefield or that its economy will crumble under the weight of US-led sanctions. The wishful view of Russia as a paper tiger has been discredited by the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive last year and by Putin's ability to shrug off an attempted mutiny last year and repeated military setbacks. And this is how the article ends. Granted, Ukraine's invasion of the Russian region of Kursk this summer was a propaganda triumph, but it has given Kiev control of just 0.006% of Russia's landmass. Here's this obsession with territorial control when this is in fact a war of attrition. Something that because it is not understood and a strategy is not being built around it, there's no possible way for the collective West or the Ukrainian proxies to overcome this reality. It is a war of attrition. Russia is soundly winning. By contrast, Moscow's forces occupy nearly 20% of Ukrainian territory. Again, this is irrelevant. It is a war of attrition, and as Russia destroys Ukraine's fighting capacity, the amount of territory it inevitably holds will increase because it is destroying its military. Despite the infusion of $200 billion of Western military and other aid, again, you could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have the physical quantity of weapons required, What are you going to buy with that money? If the weapons can't be produced, you can't buy them with that money. The West has been right to help Kiev retain its independence. It needs now to formulate a muscular long-term strategy that deters future Russian aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere without starry-eyed assumptions that Moscow is a depleted force. And then it ends, and it doesn't give even a glimpse, a shadow of a glimpse of what that strategy might entail. But I found a clue elsewhere. We'll get into that in just a moment. But I just want to point out that even as a propaganda triumph, Kursk has imploded in on itself. It is now well understood and accepted that the Kursk incursion has cost Ukraine all along the line of contact. This development we're seeing around Pokrovsk has almost certainly accelerated because of this Kursk incursion, which is now already collapsing militarily, operationally for Ukraine. This idea that the West is somehow helping Ukraine maintain its independence is also an absolute absurdity. Ukraine's actual government, representative government, however imperfect, was overthrown in 2014. The United States government and its allies overthrew an elected Ukrainian government, and they were caught red-handed picking its replacement. They installed a client regime serving Washington in its place, and from 2014 onward, they have fashioned Ukraine into a battering ram to use against Russia. This is something that has been admitted in the Western media, even if it's buried in various Western articles, and it is mentioned explicitly in US policy papers, including the 2019 Rand Corporation paper extending Russia, which I've gone over and over again. And there's an entire option dedicated to arming Ukraine and provoking Russia to intervene in Ukraine to hopefully overstretch Russia militarily and then precipitate some sort of Soviet-style collapse thereafter. Ukraine does not have any independence. You could argue that Russia invaded Ukraine, but Russia did not invade a sovereign Ukraine. It was already politically captured and in many ways occupied by US interests. The country was deliberately compromised to leave Russia with no choice but to intervene in Ukraine. And that is precisely what has happened. That is the genesis of this conflict, whether these op-eds and articles want to admit it or not. Russia is reacting to US NATO expansion right up to their borders. Russia understands that NATO expansion up to its borders is part of this. A US strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. This was 1992. This has been US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And they're talking about maintaining American primacy around the globe. They want to make sure no nation rises up and challenges US primacy around the globe. That means a nation in the Asia-Pacific region, China, for example, located in Asia, is not going to be allowed to grow in economic, political, or military strength because the US believes the United States should hold primacy over Asia, not an actual country located in Asia. So it's not that Russia and China are aggressors. They are reacting to a defined, published, admitted US foreign policy of holding dominion over the planet. Nations are clearly going to react to that. They're under no obligation to subordinate themselves to the United States within their own borders and within their own regions of the planet. Now, I did say that there is a clue to what sort of muscular policy the West might consider using to deter Russia, and I think I found it here in The Spectator, and I'm going to do a whole article and video just on this. It's by former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and it's titled, "It's Time to Let Ukraine Join NATO," and that basically is the plan. Allow Ukraine to join NATO even before the conflict ends, extend Article 5 collective defense over the areas of Ukraine that Ukraine currently holds or is holding at the time it's incorporated into NATO, and then recognizing Ukraine's right to take back all of its 1991 territory that it is determined to get back, which includes Crimea. And in this article, again, I'm going to go over it in detail in an article and a video soon to follow. Boris Johnson talks about how NATO would have to commit to the defense of Ukrainian territory, which means I wouldn't say NATO intervention into the conflict. The conflict is a NATO proxy war against Russia in the first place, but it would be a more direct intervention. And it's similar to what the United States did in Syria. The United States was waging a proxy war against Syria from 2011 onward. Its proxies were being defeated on the battlefield. The U.S. intervened militarily, and it attempted to create a pretext, create an environment permissive for it to attack the Syrian government directly. It failed. Russia intervened as well, 2015. And at best, the United States managed to create a stalemate. But if you look over time, you will see that America's position in Syria has weakened year by year, and its position in the wider region has weakened year by year. So we could look at that and we can understand, at least in a little bit of a way, how a similar scenario might play out in Ukraine. I highly doubt Russia will stop attacking targets all across Ukraine. They might try to avoid striking US bases that are built in Ukraine, but they're not going to stop striking targets across Ukraine, just like they're not stopping striking targets across Syria. They will also likely find their own proxies and use them to create plausible deniability so that they can carry out strikes against US European forces, just like they're doing in Syria. At the end of the day, and I'm going to explain this in my article and in my video, if the United States admittedly does not have enough weapons to send to Ukraine, they do not have enough weapons to fight a war they enter in directly with Russia. Maybe they could enter into a direct war with Russia if they could avoid it going nuclear. They're using their conventional weapons, their air power. They may do significant damage to Russia. It's true. It's possible. It's a possibility. But what they would do in exchange for this success in Ukraine, they would be forfeiting their position in the Middle East. That would almost certainly be challenged and displaced. They would also be forfeiting any possibility of any sort of military conflict with China in the Asia-Pacific region. So this is where we are. We're at a point in this conflict in Ukraine where the Western media is admitting how drastic the situation is for Ukraine, the inability of even the United States to supply Ukraine with enough arms and ammunition, and the reality that they never will be able to supply Ukraine with enough arms and ammunition. Now we're starting to see increasingly desperate and I would say dangerous plans to try to reverse this. I don't think it's going to reverse it. I think it's just going to make a big mess, an even bigger mess. We have to keep a close eye on all of this. We need to continue trying to wake up as many people as possible to this reality so that when politicians like Boris Johnson propose plans like this, the amount of people taking it seriously is minimum and the amount of people speaking out against it is maximized. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can follow my work. I post all of my videos on YouTube, Rumble, and also on Telegram. I publish everything else on Telegram that is banned on other platforms, including my articles that I write for Neo, which are still being blocked on X, for example. Also in the video description below are all of the links to all the articles I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.